Our last speaker for the day to wrap up what has been an awesome morning is Gideon Rachman. Gideon needs very little introduction. He is a previous speaker at Talking Investments and has been a respected journalist for over 20 years. He's been with the Financial Times since 2006 and as the chief foreign affairs correspondent. His weekly column on international affairs is a must read. In 2010, he published his book, The Zero-Sum World, to critical acclaim. Gideon began his career in 1984 at the BBC World Service. In 97 to 98, he was at Princeton College on a Fulbright Scholar, and then he became a reporter for the Sunday Correspondent. Prior to joining the Financial Times, he spent 15 years at The Economist, firstly working as a foreign correspondent in Washington, and then as bureau chief in both Brussels and Bangkok. During his time at the FT, he's earned a number of different awards, the latest of which have been in 2016 winning the Orwell Prize, which is the prestigious literary award for political writing that was set up in honor of George Orwell. He also scooped the European Press Prize Commentator Award last year. And the judges gave him very high praise. They said in their commentary that his voice was always balanced, fair, judicious, and that he leads readers around corners and offers vistas that invite them to think anew. And I think that is amazing given the world we live in. He also took Brexit as a shock, but that was not what upset him the most about 2016. Neither was it the Trump election. No, instead, what caused him the most distress during the course of last year was England's humiliating defeat at the hands of Iceland in the Euro 2016 clash. Gideon has a lot to say to us today. We gave him quite a wide brief between Trump, Brexit, Iran, Russia, Syria. We gave him quite a tall order. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Gideon to tell us, do we unravel decades of progress? Or do we actually see the ties that bind us, or do we reinforce the ties that bind us? Gideon.
Well, thanks, Kirshni. Thanks for the kind introduction and for inviting me back to South Africa after 2 years. A lot's changed. Not so sure I'm going to thank you for reminding me of that hideous evening where England were eliminated by Iceland, which was closely connected in my mind to Brexit, because it happened 2 days afterwards. And I remember going down to the bar afterwards. I was at a hotel in the Netherlands, and a German, of course, had to be a German, came up to me and said, "What is happening to your country? You voted to leave the EU, now you lose to Iceland?" It wasn't a good couple of days. But since then, that's good. So, okay. We now have something rather more serious to deal with, even than Brexit, because Britain is stopped being the world's dominant power a long time ago. The US obviously took over that role, and Donald Trump is in power, and there he is, I believe, signing an executive order. And the very fact of executive orders is slightly alarming, because I think what a lot of people said when Trump was elected was, well, the US has all these checks and balances, he can't just do anything. Well, we find actually the American president has a lot of power to do quite a lot of things simply by signing an executive order, as he's done with this refugee ban. And he is the commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful military. He has a massive intelligence apparatus at his beck and call. He will be able to change the Fed by new appointments. He will be able to change the Supreme Court by new appointments. So don't believe that he's going to be constrained by the American system. Of course he will be to some extent, but he's going to change our world, and that's really what I want to talk about. Now, trying to figure out what exactly Trump is going to mean is difficult, partly because he's such a whirlwind of news. You may remember that one of the nicknames given to him was No Drama Obama, very calm guy. It's all drama all the time with Trump, and I don't think that's a coincidence that, he came from, people think he made his money in real estate. Of course he did initially, but more recently it's in reality television. And what you've needed to do in that is constantly throw up a new story, a new angle, and he's very good at that. And so every day there's something, most people say, I can't believe he's done that. So, only yesterday he slammed the phone down on the Australian Prime Minister. They were meant to have an hour-long call. He cut it short after 25 minutes. And, if you can't get on with the Australians, you slightly wonder what the problem is. But it also makes it difficult to separate out, well, what's really important and what's just the noise. And I think for those of us who are, it's different for people living in America. They have their own sets of concerns to do with the Supreme Court, or maybe abortion or healthcare, and ultimately with the operation of their own democracy. But I think for those of us in the rest of the world, I'd identify two very big themes where Trump, it seems to me, represents a real departure from the America that we've got used to. And those are trade and security, the global security system. They're connected because Trump is a nationalist. He's an America First guy. And he is now, I think, the most protectionist president I can certainly remember in my lifetime, and certainly since the 1930s. And that is not just it's a massive economic issue, but it's also, in a way, a global security issue, because one of the things that successive American presidents did after the Second World War was decide that part of their effort to create global order, and indeed to enhance their own power, was to promote open markets, to promote what we've got to know as globalization. Trump's central proposition, really, in the campaign was that globalization had been a disaster for America, and that he's going to change it, and that he's going to change it through becoming more protectionist. And again, it was one of those things where people said, oh, well, he can't really mean that. I mean, he's a businessman. He'll talk to business people. And I think it's increasingly evident that he did mean it. He's appointed 3 very protectionist people to the key positions. Wilbur Ross, the new Commerce Secretary, the new Trade Representative, Lighthizer, and this new guy, Peter Navarro, who's in charge of a U.S. Trade Council, a new body which has been put in the White House. And there's talk of tariffs, the border tax, which was referred to earlier, maybe punitive tariffs on China if they decide they're a currency manipulator. I think they'll have a go at Mexico first. But it was interesting, Navarro gave an interview actually to my own paper, the FT, just a couple of days ago. And the implications of what he had to say for the way that multinationals operate were pretty dramatic, because he was asked about global supply chains. You know, if you're this iPhone I'm carrying, you're all carrying, of course it's assembled all over the world. There are articles about, you know, how many different parts of bits are put together in different countries. What Navarro said was that he wanted American factories not just to have factories back in America, but that to have the components back in America, that the supply chains had to be, as he put it, reshored. Now, that has very dramatic implications. Even if you're, say, a car company where the car rolls off the production line in the US, you're quite likely to have parts made in Mexico, bits made in Canada, through NAFTA. If they're going to try and break that up, businesses are certainly going to have to learn a new way of doing business, and it will have implications for their costs. It will have implications for the kinds of expenses of things that people buy in the supermarkets in America. I think, as Kirshner suggested, I don't think it's going to work in the way economically that they think it's going to work, because it will raise costs, and it will be so hard to disentangle these supply chains. But you can see the emotional appeal, and again, relating to what Gert was saying. And Gert was saying to all of us, look, you can't stand in the way of this change. You've got to learn to live with the future. You've got to be very nimble. I think a lot of what Trumpism is about is actually saying, no, we're going to stop the future. We're going to go back to the way it was. So we're going to go back to the 1950s, when we had factories all over America, when manufacturing, you could live very well off a manufacturing salary. It doesn't have to be this way. We're going to go back to an America where the population was much more solidly white, and we're going to stop the Mexicans coming in, stop the Indians coming in. I think it is a very backward-looking appeal. I don't think they'll manage to do it, but I think they could do a lot of damage on the way there. And incidentally, that statistic, I mean, I guess, given South Africa's own racial history, the question of race, I think, was pretty important to Trump. And if you want one statistic that I think maybe explains a lot of the angst of the white working class voters who pushed him into power, is that America is likely, on current trends, to become a majority-minority country by the 2040s. In other words, the white population will no longer be over 50%. They will still be the biggest group, but I think the sense that America was changing very fast, its demographics were changing very fast in a way that the core Trump voters were not happy with, and that he was promising to do something about that economically, but also culturally, demographically, has driven him to power. And this effort to sort of pull the world back to the world of the 1950s, I think, is really important. I think when it comes to security, Some of what Trump is talking about is pulling the world back to the world of the 1930s. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that he wants to, as a prelude to another world war. I don't think even he would think quite like that. But his slogan is America First. And that was the slogan of the isolationists of the 1930s, the people who were struggling to keep America out of what they could see was another war coming in Europe, who passed all sorts of acts making it impossible for America to form alliances in Europe and so on. And indeed ensured that America didn't come into the war till 1941 when they themselves were attacked by the Japanese. That's what it took. And then after the Second World War, when Americans rethought, well, what had gone wrong, I think the next generation of American leaders decided, okay, we made a mistake by withdrawing from the world. We're going to underwrite the global security system, and that's how you get NATO formed. That's how you get the US-Japanese security treaty formed, and so on. Trump has at least rhetorically questioned that. He said NATO is obsolete, that America is being exploited by its allies, and that, again, it's America first. He's going to look after the US. And that's got American allies all over the world slightly nervous because they've come to rely on the American security guarantee. And I think one danger for me is that it won't just be a question of America kind of pulling back from what Trump regards as unnecessary commitments to allies. It's not going to be pure isolationism. I think it's going to be isolationism combined with a much more aggressive attitude to what Trump regards as security threats, particularly in the Islamic world, but also in China. So America won't say, well, we're not going to do anything. It will rely on unilateral military force or economic pressure and less on a network of alliances. The Islamic world is very much at the forefront of Trump's thinking, and I don't think people have fully taken on board the radicalism of some of the thought of people like Steve Bannon and General Michael Flynn, who are really the two literally physically closest advisors to him, in the sense that Bannon is chief strategist in the White House, Flynn is the head of the National Security Council, and the fact they both sit in the White House, I think, matters because a lot of people who are looking for more traditional calming voices look to Rex Tillerson, the new head of the State Department, to Mattis at the Pentagon, but they're off in different parts of Washington. The guys next door are both pretty radical thinkers who've put the idea that the US is waging a war with, is engaged in the early stages of a kind of global war with Islamic terrorism, as they think of it, or maybe just even Islam, really at the forefront of their thinking. If you can bear it, you could look at Flynn's book called Field of Fight, I believe, which is really all about this. It's a pretty slim volume. Steve Bannon is a very interesting figure. You've probably heard of him by now, and I think he is turning out to be the kind of chief ideologist of Trump. And he's spoken very little in public, but again, if you want a flavor of his thinking, he, oddly enough, spoke at a conference organized by the Vatican 2 years ago. So if you Google Bannon Vatican, it'll come up. And it's quite an interesting text. He's clearly a smart guy, but a very radical person in his thinking. He talks about wanting to break up the established order. And again, there's this obsession with conflict with Islam. He says we're at the beginning, people in the West don't realize it, but we're at the very beginning of a massive global struggle. So this is a guy who's not thinking about keeping things calm, about managing the problem. He's thinking in terms of global conflict. So Islam, I think, is the biggest single issue in their minds. But I think the second one, and it relates to this idea of trying to go back to the world as it was, and probably the more dangerous one for the world, is China. Because China, I think a lot of American angst about their situation as a country is to do with the fact that they can feel that their period as the dominant power and sort of in a way that was pretty well unchallengeable is coming to a close. Indeed, in 2014, the IMF wasn't that much notice, but they said that China was now the world's largest economy, at least if you measure it by purchasing power. In real exchange terms, the US still is, but that would stop by about the mid-2020s. And there are other measures. China's the world's largest manufacturer. It's the world's largest exporter. It's the world's largest market for auto vehicles. In many ways, China is now, at least in economic terms, it's a peer of the United States. And China's military spending has been going up in double-digit rates for 20 years. China itself is a pretty nationalistic country. And I think the potential for a clash between the new American nationalism represented by Trump and the nationalism of China represented by Xi Jinping is quite real. And if it happens, oh, that's me, it will happen, I think, here in the South China Sea. Now you'll see the red line. It's sometimes referred to as the 9 dashed line. It's not dashed on this particular map, but it represents the waters claimed by China in the South China Sea. Now, even under Obama, the Americans had begun to say that they weren't happy with this. Hillary Clinton said that America had a national interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, because the Americans are concerned that China are essentially claiming that that's all their territorial waters. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters partly because Asia is now so central to the global economy that I think 29 of the 40 most busiest maritime trade routes go through that sea. 50% of the world's merchandise traffic goes through that sea because China's the workshop of the world. And so at the back of their minds, the Americans are thinking, maybe China is intent on one day at least putting itself in a position where it could blockade those waters or control those waters, and therefore essentially control global commerce. And those concerns have been heightened because in the middle of those seas, there are lots of little islands. That's the second slide. They've all got quite fun names: Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and so on. And some of them were barely islands, they were shoals. But what the Chinese have been doing over the last few years is building them up so that they become proper islands and then fortifying them. Oh God, I'm very bad at this, aren't I? Okay, so here we are. This is Fiery Cross Reef, and the first picture is what it looked like 10 years ago, when it was, it was a kind of your classic tropical island, and much of it kind of underwater a lot of the time. The Chinese have built it up, dredged it, now built runways on it, hangars on it, and it turned it essentially into a potential military base. And they've done this to 7 different reefs in the South China Sea. The Americans under Obama were sufficiently concerned about that to announce what they called freedom of navigation operations, where they sent ships past these things, aircraft carriers, in fact. No, actually, destroyers. And as a way of asserting American discomfort with this, and that they intended to keep the sea lanes open. But what's happened, and this hasn't really been noticed much in the press because Trump's sort of consumes all the oxygen, but is that the people just below him, in particular Rex Tillerson, have announced what sounds like a real radicalization of American policy. Tillerson, in his confirmation hearing, said that the Americans objected to the fortification of these islands and that the US under Trump would attempt to deny China access to those islands, which sounded like a threat to blockade them. Now, if they were to do that, you would probably end up with a war. And I know that sounds very melodramatic, but the reaction in the Chinese press, which of course is controlled by the government, immediately said, well, if this happens, there will be a large-scale and catastrophic war, was I think what the Global Times said. And it's not just the Chinese sort of beating their chest to saying that. When I was in Davos, I moderated a session on Asian security, and the Singaporean foreign minister was there, and he's very kind of, he's not a hysterical guy, but when I asked him about that Tillerson comment, he said, oh, well, if the Americans try that, there will be a war. And yet the Americans at least appear to have pledged to do it. Now, I suspect that they will climb down or that they won't emphasize it again, but there is a possibility, if you combine what's happening in the South China Sea with the heightening of trade tensions, which is likely to happen when the Americans start discriminating against Chinese goods, and the change of American policy on Taiwan, which I won't go into, but which is a deeply sensitive issue for China, you're at the very least, I think, heading towards a period of heightened confrontation between the US and China, which will, even if it doesn't lead to military conflict, lead to very tough diplomatic confrontations, which I think are likely to express themselves in a deterioration of the economic relationship. And so this globalized world that we've got used to in which, for all their kind of rivalries, the US and China got closer and closer together, have a very interdependent economic relationship, and that kind of set the tone for the globalization of the whole world economy, that political conflict wasn't really disrupting the closer networks of economic ties. I think that's coming to a close under Trump. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Brexit as well. There we have Trump with Nigel Farage, who was the kind of leader of the Brexit campaign, because I think it's part of this whole project, if you like, of attempting to turn the world back to the 1950s. I think, again, part of what the Brexiteers were saying in the UK was, you know, it doesn't have to be like this. We can go back to a world of solid borders, of a Britain that is independent from the EU, that doesn't have to take all these laws from the European Union, and things will be better. Don't believe those who say the EU is the way of the future. And that was a seductive enough appeal that the Brexiteers won. And they also rather cleverly packaged it as a forward-looking thing, not a backward-looking thing. So they said, look, the EU is in trouble, no doubt about that. Europe is moribund. Look at that chart, for example. Shows Britain's exports to the rest of the world are growing, to the EU falling. That was both a forward-looking and a backward-looking appeal in a way, because it was forward-looking to the sense that, correct, that the rest of the world is growing faster than Europe, but also, I think, to a slight imperial nostalgia in Britain that we can be a global player. We don't just have to be a component part of the European Union. Now, how will Brexit work out? Look, I think that there is a rising sense of confidence in Britain. I fear misplaced, but I could be wrong, because a lot of the campaign from the people who were saying, don't do this, it's crazy, said there's going to be an immediate economic hit, loss of confidence, that there'll be a recession. The Bank of England was saying that. That hasn't happened. And so a lot of people saying, it was a scare story. And there have been a couple of other scare stories, so that we remember that in Britain, when we didn't join the European single currency, which while most other members of the EU did, there were also people saying, that'll be a disaster, car companies won't invest, the city will move. That didn't happen either. And so it is the case that the pro-European camp have slightly discredited themselves in the UK by being too alarmist in the past. And if we're honest, as one of the other presentations said, nobody can be definitive in predicting how it's going to go. It might be okay. I worry, though, that when I look at the politics and the way the politics are going to play out in the form of the negotiations with the EU, that we're heading, at least in the short term, for a very confrontational divorce with the European Union, and that could be very, very disruptive to business. The reason being that the EU, precisely because it's in trouble, cannot afford to give Britain an easy time, because they worry that the next guys we're going to have a look at, who are these two, Wilders and Le Pen, who are campaigning for their countries, the Netherlands in his case, France in her case, to either leave the euro or leave the European Union altogether. If Britain appears to be doing well, they'll say, look, there's a future outside the EU. So the EU, unfortunately, has to make it clear that Britain is doing badly by leaving the EU. So they're not going to give us a good deal. And it's going to start, I think, with them calculating a vast divorce bill. It is a bit like a divorce. And they're going to say, okay, we're going to divide up the things and look at your liabilities, and they're going to present us, believe it or not, with a bill of 50 billion euros sometime in June, saying these are your commitments that you've signed up to in future EU budgets, future EU programs, etc., and you can't just walk away from them, so we'd like the money up front now. And exactly, that is going to be the reaction of the British public. They're going to say, you're joking, you're having a laugh. And they'll say, no, no, we're not joking. And in fact, before we can even talk about a trade deal, pay. And at that point, I think the British will be more or less compelled by the politics of it in the UK to walk away. And when they do that, we've already triggered Article 50. We voted to do it yesterday. Article 50 is saying we're going to be out in 2 years. Once that clock is ticking, unfortunately, Britain's negotiating power diminishes each minute, because the EU can sit on its hands and say, okay, guys, well, you're out in 2 years anyway. And at that point, we then, if we don't have a deal, we'll be in an international legal action over this 50 billion euro bill, but we also won't have new trade arrangements in place. will have to fall back on the World Trade Organization rules, and in some cases that'll mean, for example, tariffs of 10% on cars manufactured in Britain that are exported to the EU, which is a big blow, obviously, given that that's a crucial industry for the UK. We now make more cars than the French do, and that's partly because a lot of Japanese manufacturers move to Britain precisely to export to the EU. There'll be problems for the financial services industry. Already you're seeing some job losses, and there'll be problems, I think, the EU will, in their efforts to show, look, this is really not a good idea, will not be keen on, we heard about frictionless. The border between the EU and the UK will become a lot more friction-full. There'll be customs forms to fill in. There'll be backups of lorries. They want that, and I fear we're going to get it. Now, it doesn't mean that in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, that there is not a perfectly decent future for Britain outside the EU. But I think it's going to be pretty disruptive, and the political consequences of it, I think, will be felt, unfortunately, a sharp deterioration in relations between Britain and the EU, a temptation for Britain to move closer to Donald Trump's America, but that could be difficult for all the reasons that we understand. Certainly be controversial in Britain. So our politics feel a lot less stable, as does our economic future. And of course, the future of the EU matters for you guys out here because, as they will remind you, they are still collectively the world's largest single market. So if they're in trouble, we all are. I think I will stop there. I was going to talk a little bit about Turkey and so on, but I'm conscious I don't want to keep you too long from your lunch, and we can also have a little time for Q&A and maybe address that there. So that's the world we're living in. It is a world defined now by Trump, and in Europe by Brexit, which is a kind of related event. And then there's all the other turmoil, which hasn't gone away in the Middle East, and so on. But I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think we haven't talked Turkey or we haven't talked the Middle East, but maybe that's a good place to start. The US's sort of deliberate war on Islam and its stated position in that regard, and with the executive order last week in preventing a number of people from a number of countries coming into the US, what does it mean for the tilt of the balance of power in the Middle East and for the 20-year war that we have been fighting on terrorism?
Well, I mean, I think, we're going to discover more as it goes on. I'd be surprised if even the Trump administration have fully thought it through. So that, for example, you're already running into a couple of real contradictions in the policy. So that one of the countries on the banned list, is Iraq. Now, Americans are currently there, 6,000 Americans fighting to defeat Islamic State, based in Iraq, which Trump says the war on IS is his major initiative, his major goal. But he didn't perhaps foresee that, of course, the Iraqis would react emotionally and say, well, we're going to stop visas for Americans. So what do you do about not just the special forces, perhaps they'll make an exception for armed men, but for all the support people, etc. So you're immediately going to run into unintended consequences. My guess is that as they look at all the divisions in the Islamic world, and it is very hard to have a coherent policy. I mean, Obama didn't manage. I think one of the reasons America didn't get involved in Syria was not just that Obama was reluctant to get involved in another war in the Middle East, but also because they couldn't come up with a policy that made sense. Did they want Assad to go? Did they not want him to go? Were they confident that the people they were backing were people that you could really back with confidence? And because they couldn't resolve that questions, the policy was a mess. I suspect where Trump will end up will be that he will back Sunni strongmen. They like the look of anybody who says, I'm going to control jihadis for you. I'm going to lock them all up. I don't care about human rights, etc. So Sisi in Egypt, I think, is the model. They'll go with him. I don't think they'll take on the Saudis, although there's a lot of American angst about the Saudis because of the memory of how many of the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, the knowledge of how much Saudi money goes to spreading radical Wahhabi ideas around the world. But the Saudis are economically important. They're a military ally. They're crucial in holding the line against Iran, which appears to be a higher concern. So I think that Trump's America is going to basically ally with the Sunnis against the Shia. And I'm not sure that's a great idea because it's getting you inveigled in a big conflict in the Middle East that will run for decades. But that's my guess of where they'll go.
And then Turkey. We haven't spent time talking about Turkey because clearly all the stuff that happened with Erdogan last year, the coup, whether it was staged or not staged, in order to help him claim a lot more power, that's clearly tilted not only the material dynamics in that part of Europe.
Yeah, and I think that Turkey is a sort of small example of, as I said, although Trump crowds out all space, and if you're British, so does Brexit, of other things that are going wrong in the world, in the sense that Turkey was a place that you could look to with great optimism 10 years ago. You could say, here was an example of a country, majority Muslim country, that was also a functioning democracy, that managed to have a secular society, a booming economy, that was looking to Europe, that did business happily across the world, and where Europeans were happy doing business with them and going on holiday. And now you're seeing a country that partly it's not the fault of the government, that is much less stable than it was. The bit that's not the fault of the government is the poor country is next door to Syria. They've got 2 to 3 million Syrian refugees on their soil. As somebody said, one of Trump's achievements was to make Erdogan look like a humanitarian, because at least he does admit refugees into the country. And they've also now got the backwash of IS terrorism and a Kurdish terrorist problem. So you're getting bombs going off all over Istanbul and Ankara, and the tourism trade is collapsing as a result, and it's really important to them. But also you have another nationalist strongman. In a way, before they arrived in the West, these figures were cropping up elsewhere, in Turkey, in Russia, obviously, with Putin, who is waging a sort of culture war, trying to take on the secular liberals. It's actually slightly, in a funny way, reminiscent of what's happening in America, where you have the coastal elites who are very alienated from Trump, but Trump himself is backed by the conservative heartlands. Same thing in Turkey, with the added religious element. The people in Istanbul that I know are absolutely horrified by Erdogan, but they don't hold the wheels of power anymore. And Erdogan is consolidating power around himself. As you say, there's a question mark about what happened in that coup, but the consequences we know is that a lot of people have been arrested, papers have been, if not closed down, intimidated into silence. There are more journalists imprisoned in Turkey than in China. And they're now rounding up people in the universities. And, that's bad in itself, and it's also doesn't say much for the social peace of Turkey. And just last thing, it's also not something we can ignore, because if you're South Africa, you're bracketed with them as an emerging market, the fragile five and all that. And it may be irrational to think of you in, this, but it happens. And for Britain and the EU, Turkey's our near neighbor. It's where the refugees flowed through. It's a member of NATO. It's a very important country.
And then Russia. We haven't spoken about Putin much, but he's been in his alleged activities have been in the press quite substantially. And with the look of a new order rising, they seem to favor the type of outlook in the world that he could have a lot of sway in.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the nationalist right in Europe and in the US is their frank admiration for Putin. They look to him almost as an archetype of the strong leader, of the guy who sticks up for his country. And I thought it was very interesting in Simon's presentation when he talked about the falling interest and faith in democracy in South Africa. Unfortunately, if you happen to be a Democrat, that's quite a common phenomenon. If you look at opinion polls in the US and in Europe, people are less inclined to say, as they might have done after the fall of the Berlin Wall, oh, well, democracy is clearly the best system, delivers the best results, etc. People are now, I think, increasingly intrigued by the strongman model, and Putin is the archetype of that. And I think another reason that Trump may be interested in him, aside from all the blackmail stuff, which may be real, actually, it's very hard to tell. But there's also this culture war stuff. Because the people around Trump think in terms of a struggle for Western civilization against Islam, they see Putin essentially as a kind of white man, a European. Some of this may sound oddly familiar to you in South Africa, and who's waging a war in Chechnya and Syria against Islam. So he's their guy. And then finally, this whole very effective intervention in destabilizing Western politics. People now are seeing Russians everywhere. Maybe they're there, maybe they're not. But so that the leading candidate in the French presidency is in terrible trouble now, François Fillon, because suddenly revelations appeared about money he'd been paying to his wife in a French satirical newspaper. And people are saying, no, isn't that interesting? The Russians might be behind that. I actually think probably not, because Fillon was quite pro-Russian. But this sort of sense that we're vulnerable now to manipulation of our politics is really out there.
And then let's talk about France, because Marine Le Pen, you put up, you made some initial comments that there's a real chance that she could win the election. But the impact of that on the euro, we haven't, euro and eurozone, we haven't discussed.
Yeah.
But if she wins the election...
Well, I think then the euro, you instantly have a financial crisis. I mean, I have to say, I would have said 2 weeks ago, I think it's highly unlikely that she'll win the election. Now, with the troubles of Fillon and also looking at the Brexit Trump trend, I'd still put it at 1 in 3, but that's a lot. She's about 30% in the polls. So the thing is that Le Pen has said, I don't know whether her current position is that France will pull out of the euro, or whether she said they will have a referendum on pulling out of the euro. She's gone backwards and forwards on that. But if France were to pull out of the euro, obviously the single currency would be a goner, I think. But you would also have panic in the financial markets, because people would begin to think, well, all these debts that the French owe us in euros, are they going to devalue because they're going to be paid back in devalued French francs? So you'd have a capital flight. You might have the reimposition of currency controls in Europe as they attempted to control that. Again, it's these sort of laws of unintended consequences. And I think that more broadly, Le Pen has applauded Britain's decision to leave the EU. I think she clearly would like to leave the EU herself. And even if she didn't want to, or just changed her mind on that, or the French voted against it, I'm not sure that Germany, modern Germany, could work, or Merkel's Germany could work with Le Pen, given her pretty frank Islamophobia and the difference between Merkel's stance and hers on all sorts of issues. So it would be the biggest crisis the EU's ever faced, and possibly a terminal crisis.
And then my last question is coming back to Trump. I think at the time of his win of the election, there was a lot of understanding that, as we know, there are lots of checks and balances in the American system, and that a lot of the Republicans currently, controlling both houses, were a lot more rational in terms of their outlook on the world. He's signing of a whole lot of executive orders over the last week and a bit without any repercussions from within the Republican Party. Do you think his presidency could actually cause a split within the Republican Party? And also what it means for, the enforceability of a lot of the things he talked about in his campaign trail?
Yeah, well, look, we're in week 1, and so like a lot of us, the Republicans will be, maybe it's week 2 now, are trying to figure out what the hell is going on, and where they should put their attention. Because as I said, Trump is such a blizzard. You think, my God, I've got to react to this. Oh, but something else has happened. And so people like McCain and Lindsey Graham, who are probably the Republicans in the Senate who've been most outspoken, and remember their majority in the Senate, I think it's 52 to 48, so if they lose a couple of Republicans, you've instantly got a break there. They have focused initially on Russia because they're Cold War people. And they are very anxious about Trump's relationship with Russia, and the issue they focused on is telling him not to lift sanctions. Now, I don't think you should lift sanctions on Russia. Personally, I think there are other things that would worry me more about Trump, actually. But that may be the rallying issue for certain Republicans. But I think I'm a little, as somebody who wants to see some controls on Trump, a little depressed about the willingness of the Republicans to stick their necks out. I think for 2 reasons. They're not going to really do it, possibly until things really get out of control. The first is that Trump won their nomination. Trump beat the whole Republican Party. They're scared of their base. Congressmen have to run for re-election every 2 years. Senators have to raise money all the time. Current opinion polls show that 82% of Republican voters think Trump is doing great. And so Republican politicians have to think that Trump will target them if they go after them, and he could destroy them. So they'll be worried about that. And also, frankly, some of them agree with him on quite a lot of the stuff. Maybe not on Russia, maybe not on the refugee ban, maybe. You know, they'll look for the positive. They'll say, oh well, at least he's doing tax reform. At least he's doing he's turning the Supreme Court more conservative. They're hungry for power. These guys. They haven't had a Republican president for a long time. They will try to use it and turn away from the stuff that they don't like until it's really impossible to ignore.
Okay, on that note, vigilant note, I'm going to say thank you very much.
Pleasure.